More than 30 years ago, when I was at McMaster University, I was involved in the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship group there. And I remember they had one evening a really nice talent show for the students. And it was beautiful because there were so many students who came and they really had just stunning talent when you saw it. But there's one particular panel of photographs that has never escaped my mind through 30 years. And what it was a panel, big panel like this, and a bunch of pictures of lightning, beautiful pictures of lightning. And so someone had gone out and taken shots of lightning, presumably with a tripod, perhaps not the best thing to do in a lightning storm. But anyway, so they were beautiful time exposures of lightning. And in the corner at the bottom, he had put the passage that we're going to be looking at today. He had put the verse, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him," which comes from Mark chapter 4, verse 41. And it was a very impressive thing because you looked at this and you saw, wow, what power. And then you realized the power was in Christ. It was a wonderful artistic way of demonstrating the wonder of the passage that we're going to be looking at today. And this is a continuation in our series. We've been looking at different questions that come up in the Bible and how the answers are important for our lives today. And so this is another one, the question of who is this? Who is Christ when we see him in control of nature? So for full context, let's go and take a look at Mark chapter 4 and reading from verse 35 to 41. Mark 4 and 35. That day when evening came, he, that is Jesus, said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And Matthew's version says, "What kind of a man is this?" Which is interesting. We'll look at that a bit later. Even the wind and waves obey him. So this was a moment for the disciples. This was a real watershed moment for them in terms of their understanding of who Jesus was. And why was this? Why was this so significant a difference for them? They had, after all, seen Jesus already, and if we can look back in Mark, you will see, we've seen Jesus already cast out demons and heal people right before their disciples. And you would think, well, isn't this impressive enough that they would see Jesus do miracles, casting out demons and healing people? Wouldn't that be enough? Why is this a big step more, that they would see him calm the waters and now start to question who really is this? You see, back in Mark 1 and verses 21 to 28, Jesus casts out an unclean spirit. And in Mark 2, 1 to 12, he heals a paralyzed man. But this power direct power over nature is a step beyond that in the disciples' mind. It's noteworthy when we look at those passages back in Mark chapter 1, that their explanation was not, "Who is this?" but "What is this?" So they were taken up then more with what Jesus was doing than it was with him himself. But this time, the emphasis is different. They look and see and wonder who he is himself. And there's a very good reason for this difference. There's a really good reason for this difference. And the reason is that in the Old Testament, any teaching of direct authority over nature implied deity. In other words, it implied that the person himself must be God, because only God was creator. Only God, therefore, could have any kind of direct change over creation. Things having to do with spiritual forces, things having to do with healing even, didn't have the same impact as someone who could simply speak to nature directly and change it, which is what Jesus was doing. And many of the Psalms, and that's why we read this morning Psalm 29, because that really speaks directly to God's power in nature that they were aware of. And also Psalm 104, and I think I will read this, the first 9 verses of that, because that really gives us also that sense of God, God's power being over nature. Psalm 104, beginning to read at verse 1. Praise the Lord, my soul. Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. The Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of the upper chambers of their waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes winds his messengers, flames of fire his servants. He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. That's a reference to the flood. But at your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. They flowed over the mountains and went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them, and set a boundary they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. So it's interesting, these references to the flood as well. We saw that also in Psalm 29. So this would have meant also a connection to God as the judge and also God's mercy as well. So when the disciples saw this power in the calming over the seas, they would recognize that back to not only Jesus as possibly being more than a man, being God himself, but also as the one who could judge and the one who could also forgive in his mercy. Notice that the rebuke was also direct. Jesus did not call on the Father to stop the waves. He rebuked directly. You see, Moses also had power over nature, didn't he? But not directly. When the seas of the Red Sea were parted, it was always, if you look at the passages, there's always a connection to asking the Father to do these things, asking God to do these. Moses was, in effect, the means, but God was the one who did it. But in this case, God did it, Jesus did it directly, indicating his deity. So why did this have an impact on them? It had an even greater impact on them because they knew that they were his disciples. He had called them. So this was a sense now that they weren't just called by a person. They were called by God himself to a special ministry. And so it says that they were frightened. In fact, if you notice in the passage, verse 41, they were terrified. They were terrified after the sea was calmed, when they saw the power of God, perhaps even more than they were when they were in jeopardy in the boat, when the waves were coming over the sides of the boat. What was more terrifying to them was the fact that they were with one who was God himself. It's no wonder then that later in the New Testament, when we read, for instance, John's Gospel, Jesus is portrayed as creator. John chapter 1 verse 3 said, "Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." So here Jesus is presented by John in his gospel as creator. And Paul too in Colossians 1:16 and 17 says, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So the one, obviously, who holds all things together can also intervene and change things, which is what Jesus did here in calming the water. There's another very interesting thing in this passage, and I think it's going to be a good lesson for us. I know it is for me when I meditate on it. And that's that their response was not, "Who is this, the one who delivers us from our peril?" but rather, "Who is this, even the winds and waves obey him?" In other words, they marveled not so much at being saved from their difficulties, but on his power. Their primary response was to marvel at who he was rather than what he did for them. And this is very important in our world today, because as a culture, we're very me-centered, aren't we? And that's pervaded into the church a great deal as well. We tend to think that God's main purpose sometimes is to some way assist us, but it isn't. He is in no way answerable to us, and yet we think we can evaluate God and whether or not he is just and compassionate. You see that all the time in people's attitudes, not only out in the world, but also in the church. It pervades as well. But this was not how the disciples responded. They responded in a way that was all about him, not about them. I remember seeing an interview once on a British television program, and they were interviewing this wealthy British landowner, and he exclaimed quite seriously, and I've never forgotten this, he said, "Without God as my right-hand man, I would not be able to manage this property." And when I say it, I start laughing, but it's really not funny. This person thought that God was in some way his right-hand man. Really? God is your right-hand man? Do you hear yourself? That was what I was thinking. But, you hear this sort of thing quite often, and then you evaluate it and you think, you, God? They've got it all wrong. It's a perspective in which God is here to help me, instead of am I part of God's plan? How am I fitting in to what God has? When you think about the Lord's Prayer, and where it says, on earth as it is in heaven, right? It's like saying, I want to fit into what God has planned in heaven. I want earth to be like how he would have it be. And that should be our approach. When I thought of this example of this fellow who said this, I thought so much of our lives, look to myself as well. We look and see how God fits into what we're doing instead of seeing how we should fit into what God is doing. So much of our lives tends to be taken up with how God makes us feel instead of how we should respond to him. And the thing about nature, and this is an example of God's rule over nature, isn't it? The thing about creation and nature about us, that we see about us, is it deflects attention off us and onto God, because it is so much greater and so much more powerful. When we think about God's nature, or we also think about God's goodness, not just to us, but to everybody. We think about God's common grace, because the sun shines on both the righteous and the unrighteous. The rain falls on both the righteous and the unrighteous. God is good to all through his creation. And so there's that aspect as well. Several weeks ago, Steve spoke to us on Job's declaration in Job chapter 38, God's declaration to Job in Job 38, where God says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And this was a big wake-up call for Job, because up till then he was arguing with his friends about, just how, whether God was being just with him or not, and so on. And God had to reset him to a godly view of how God looks down upon us, instead of us always evaluating God. And I think it's significant that beginning in Job 38 and onwards, it's all about nature. It's all about the power of creation. It's to remind Job that Job should evaluate God's goodness, not just on his personally, how he sees it, but on a universal level of God's goodness to all. And it's also to remind Job that God is so much greater than his particular situation. He is full of power and awe, and his grandeur and his splendor fills the whole earth. And this is what the disciples discovered when the sea was calmed. They discovered his power, the power of one who has that grandeur and that power over nature. They were humbled to a great degree. Their worship was no longer subjective, but became objective. It wasn't just what Jesus had done for them. It was who he was. Who is this? They said. Not what have you done for us. I don't know how many of you are space fans. I am. So last Thursday was a big day for me. There was a great launch of the world's largest rocket. And the kind of camera work they do now on board rockets is amazing. And so you had this view of it coming up through all the layers of the cirrus and stratocirrus clouds on the way up, and then you could see it going into orbit. You could see the curvature of the earth. You could see all the clouds. You could see the whole beauty of nature all spread out so wonderfully. And it just reminded me of that, the one who has that power over nature, and how we need to objectify our worship and worship him for who he is in his power and his splendor. And there are so many, we become blasé, don't we? But sometimes you wake up in the morning and say, what a wonderful place this is. And who made it? The God of the universe. It had nothing to do with me. I didn't make myself. Nothing to do with these pompous people in politics. They didn't make themselves. It's God and God alone. And we need that sobering and uplifting way of looking at things, and to be reminded that way. And so for Job too, it was basically God saying to him, all that musings you had with your friends and trying to work out whether things were righteous or not, that's really not important. Look at the whole creation. Look at my goodness to all, and you see it all unfolding. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? And similarly, the disciples too had that same sense of awe as they saw all that tumult of the waves and the wind vanishing to pure calmness. But having said and having known and appreciated that God's greatness is beyond anything to do with us, that does not mean that he doesn't care for us, and cares for us very, very deeply. just that it doesn't end with care for us. It goes way beyond, doesn't it? In fact, this whole story, definitely a true story, definitely an event that actually happened, but it's also a wonderful allegory of God's care for us. So I think it would be nice to close by looking at it that way. If you look at it as an allegory, it's very interesting and very comforting. We can see the rough water representing difficult times that we have in our lives. Times when we feel that things are about to capsize. We feel like we're on that boat, don't we? Many times in our lives. There seems to be little hope. Things are rough, things are difficult. And we look over and we see Jesus, but he's asleep. And where is he asleep? He's asleep at the stern, at the back, where the rudder is. Who's in control? We wonder. I thought God was in control, particularly in times of difficulty. How often we feel this way in times of difficulties. A few weeks ago, Tommy looked at the question in Psalm 10 and verse 1. Why, Lord, do you stand afar off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And this sentiment is expressed in other Psalms too. In Psalm 44, verses 23 to 26, speaks even of God as appearing to be asleep. The psalmist says, "Awake, O Lord. Why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our miseries and oppression? We are brought down to dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help. Rescue us because of your unfailing love." And in this passage that we're looking at, we have a similar question from the disciples' attention. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" they cry. God seems at times to be sleeping, and that's when our hardship is sometimes the greatest. But that is only our impression. That's only our perception. God is very much in control all the time, even when we may not realize it. Because you notice when Jesus wakes up, he makes no mention of the fact that being asleep might have been a problem for his disciples. He doesn't in any way apologize or say, "Oh, I'm sorry I was asleep during this difficult time." No, rather he questions their faith and says, "Why were you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" That's implying that even when we sense God as being asleep, he isn't. We know that. And the onus is still on us to have faith and to recognize that sometimes God appears to be silent and asleep during those times that are difficult, but it's then that he's carrying us, that he's looking after us in a way that we can never imagine. This tells us that our faith should remain strong even when we visually don't see God so clearly. He is still working to resolve our difficulties behind the scenes. A connection between our struggles and God's actions may not be seen straight away, but they will be seen, and we can be sure of that. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is a confidence in what we hope for and the assurance about what we do not see." So the essence of faith is that, isn't it? The essence of faith is being sure about things that are unseen. And that's an encouragement to us. He is working out his perfect will, even when he is absent and appears to be asleep in our mind. He is not absent, but he is there, and he is working. He will rebuke those winds and calm them down. Notice that Mark says it was completely calm. Completely calm. He emphasizes that. It's not as if the boat sort of struggled to and made it to the shore and wow, we made it. No, it became completely calm. The boat didn't merely make it to shore, but glided through glass-smooth water, the only wake being that of the bow and the oars. I'm thinking of those early mornings by a lakeside, particularly Frontier Lodge. Those of you who've been to Frontier Lodge, you get up early in the morning, and Lake Wallace is just like, it's absolutely beautiful. Maybe a bit of mist as well. It must have been just like that. For the disciples in the boat, and the awe that they struck from what it was like a few seconds before, and the power, and they realized this is something most wonderful. And it's a lesson to us of the peace that God can bring to us also in tumultuous times, beyond what we can imagine, completely calm. This calm brings to mind the final verse of Bernard de Clairvaux's well-known hymn, Jesus, Thou Joy of Loving Hearts. And it goes like this. O Jesus, ever with us stay. Make all our moments calm and bright. Chase the dark night of sin away. Shed o'er this world thy holy light. May this be our experience as we continue to trust in him.